All right, folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to episode 4 of Building Automation Monthly TV. And in this episode, I'm going to be taking you through how you can go and develop yourself or your building automation technicians. I figured you guys probably have not seen me in person, so it's about time I actually show myself on this live stream versus you guys just looking at a white screen. Although we will get plenty of white screen time, so don't worry about that. But I just wanted to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Phil Zito, the owner of Building Automation Monthly, and behind me is my whiteboard slash film studio slash office where I create all of my courses. I've been in the building automation industry for over a decade now, started as a service tech coming out of the US military, and recently resigned from leading the technical integration program at Johnson Controls. And now I run Building Automation Monthly, which is a provider of online training for building automation professionals. And in this episode, we are going to be discussing training. So let's dive in. I'm going to switch over here to this screen right here. And we are going to go and take a look at this whiteboard. And what we are going to be covering in today's episode is going to be what makes a good development and training plan, and then 2, how can we go about implementing a training plan? How can we go and understand what training we need, and how can we go about implementing that training? So let me just get things set here real quick. That way I can see your questions as they come in, and I'm going to get diving in. So there's 3 things that make a training and development plan good, right? The first thing is that it needs to be customized to the actual person going through the training. Back when I was managing 22 technicians and I was going about training them, I did a lot of things wrong at first. I tried to go and train everyone at the same level. So that was the first thing I did wrong. Second thing I did wrong was I thought that everyone understood the things I understood. And going and taking those 2 things and creating a training program when you think you're going to train everyone at the same level and you think that everyone understands all this information, that's a recipe for disaster. And I see folks do that a lot because, quite honestly, it's easy, right? It is really easy to go and not customize a training program, to just go and train folks on a set of things. And the reality is that is quite possibly the least effective way to train someone. So the second thing that makes a training program good is that it is measurable. And what I'm talking about here is that folks go kind of either to one extreme where they don't measure anything at all and they just say, oh, go learn it on the job, do your time, you'll figure it out. Or they go to the complete opposite extreme where they measure every single little minute of activity. You want to kind of aim for the middle here, whereas you want to measure skills. And we'll talk about that in just a second when we talk about defining skill sets, identifying skill set gaps, and then identifying strengths and weaknesses. So you want to be able to measure an increase in skills. So it has to be measurable. And the third thing that is important is that it's got to be rapidly impactful. And here's what I mean by that. It's all well and good if it takes a year to go and onboard someone, but you can't wait a year to start billing for having a tech out on a job site. You can't wait a year until your salespeople can go and quote projects. You can't wait a year until your programmer or your designer can create designs or create programs. I mean, that's simply in today's day and age, with the shortage we have of skill set, you can't go and wait that long. So when I say rapidly impactful, what I'm really saying here is that we want to identify key skills for the role that that person plays, and this is why training needs to be customized. We want to identify the key skills And we want to go and get those key skills learned to a level of functionality as quick as possible. All right? So those are the three things that make up a good training and development plan. Now let's look at the steps. So there are 7 steps to creating a training and development plan. The first step, and this is one folks often skip, is defining the skill set for the role. Remember how I said that folks go and they tend to not customize training? They tend to give everyone the same amount of training. Well, here what we want to do is we want to figure out the roles that are on our team, and then we want to figure out what skill sets those roles absolutely need. So, for example, a programmer does not let's do that, right? Let's do a programmer, because this seems to be the hardest role from a technical perspective for BAS folks to fill, right? So a programmer does not need electrical knowledge. I know that may fly in the face of what some of you have been taught. Some of you may have been taught the only way you can be a programmer is if you've done your time as a tech and then as a designer, because that's the natural progression, right? Tech, designer, programmer. But they don't necessarily need to know electrical fundamentals. They need to know what kind of outputs they're commanding, but they don't need to know the deep and dirty aspects of electricity. In addition to that, a programmer does not necessarily need to know IT. I know this is shocking because I go and I beat the drum all the time about how important learning IT is for building automation professionals. And it really is very important for building automation professionals to know IT. I mean, you've got IP-enabled controls, you've got cloud-hosted databases, you've got cloud-hosted servers, you've got remote access issues, you've got IoT with things like the Belimo valve. I talked about that in the past. That's a really promising product. And so you've got all these things that require IT knowledge, but a programmer does not necessarily have to have mastery. What does a programmer need to have? So if these aren't true, what does a programmer need to have? Well, they need to understand HVAC sequences, and they need to be able to take those HVAC sequences, and they need to turn them into code. At the end of the day, this is really all they need to know. They need to know how to look at a sequence of operations and turn that sequence of operations into code. So if you're spending time, and this is one of those mistakes that I made very early on when I was managing technicians. If I was spending time with my programmers teaching them how to install controllers on VAV boxes. Can you see why that would not be a good use of their training time? So rather, what you want to do is you want to go and you want to focus in on the areas that are going to most impact their job, which is mastery of HVAC sequences and code. So let's do another one of these, right? Let's go through another one. So define skill set, right? And let's take a technician, just your basic install tech. So we'll just say install tech. Install techs don't need to know how to program. They do not need to know how to create designs. However, they do need electrical knowledge. So let me go in and blast these things out. They do need to have potentially some IT knowledge. So these would be areas where we would focus in. Do they understand how to terminate wires, especially if you're going and executing the install in-house instead of using subcontractors? Do they know how to go and make sure that the supervisory devices are connected to the network, that the server's set up? These kind of things. These install techs would need to have these skills. So you can start to see that as you define skill sets, what essentially you want to do is you want to create essentially a matrix, right? And the matrix would have the name of the tech, would have their role, and then would have, ideally you want to focus on 1 to 3 skills at a time. So you'd have skill 1, skill skill 2, and then I'm just going to write SK3. And you would write out, so like this is Bob, and he's a tech, and Bob's a former electrician, so he doesn't need that electrical skills. And we'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses in just a second. But what you would do is you'd say, okay, skill 1, Bob maybe needs to learn some IT stuff. And maybe skill 2 is Bob's an electrician, but Bob doesn't understand how to read mechanical plans, so we may say he needs to read mechanical plans. And then skill 3, maybe he doesn't have a skill 3. And then we'd look at John, and John's a programmer. And let's say John has an IT background, but he doesn't have an HVAC background. So the first thing we're going to have to do is go and get him HVAC SOP, kind of sequence of operations experience. And then we may want to go and say, okay, well, Bob is a tritium guy, and now he's working for Allerton or Johnson or Siemens, so we may want to get him familiar with coding. Now, that may shock some of you that I said we want to do the coding as skill 2 and not skill 1. It doesn't matter if John knows how to use the software if he doesn't understand how to take an HVAC sequence of operations and turn it into code. So that is what we're looking at right here is John, he's a programmer, and we want to teach him the sequence of operations because then and only then can he turn it into code. So skill 1, or step 1, find the skill set for the role. Now step 2, and this is another area a lot of folks get hung up on, is evaluating the skill set. Now, in the world of evaluation, you have kind of 2 kinds of evaluations, and I'm going to try to remember these terms. Hopefully I'm using them accurately. You have, oh my gosh, right when I say that, that term slips my mind. Yes, qualitative and quantitative. Okay, I'm not the world's best speller, which is honestly kind of funny because I wrote a book, but that's what spell check and Grammarly are for. Quantitative. That is not even close to spelled right. But qualitative and quantitative, here's the thing. So qualitative evaluation is where you're going to go and do things like interviews. So you're going to ask folks, how does this person work? What are their strengths around this? Da, 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 da. And then quantitative are exams, tests, and skill practice. Now, personally, especially with technicians, I lean more towards the quantitative. Qualitative, often folks will either be too critical or they'll be too nice. So I quite honestly, the whole interview process, and it doesn't work for me and my experience with technicians. Also, and I just sent an email to my email list about this yesterday, but technicians have often struggled to sell their skills. So if you're looking at interviews and evaluations, oftentimes the technician will not go and sell their skill sets. But quantitative, the exams, the tests, the skill practices, these are ways that you can go and find out skills. And it's actually not as hard as you think. So I'm just going to call this S2 because that's step 2. But an example for a technician, right? One that I used to do all the time is we had a basic VAV box and we had it in our warehouse. And what we did was we had a leaderboard, essentially with people's ranks on there, and we would time how long it would take the technicians to properly install a VAV controller. You know, did you properly terminate? Did you properly mount? Etc., etc. And then the person at the end of the month with the greatest or the least amount of time to install properly would get a gift card. I was doing 2 things with that. One, I was creating competition, which was driving folks to really learn stuff and compete with one another and kind of call each other out and create that camaraderie, which that's a whole nother topic. But 2, I was also evaluating the skill sets because I would be there when they were doing this. And if someone struggled with understanding where a shaft was on a damper blade, then that kind of told me where they were at mechanically. Or if they struggled with understanding how to do termination of trunks or things like that, or wires, that kind of told me where they were electrically. So I was able to go and evaluate the skill set of techs. You could do the exact same thing for programmers. So for S2, here we go. S2 for programmers, you would do something like take a basic sequence. And the key here is to find basic things like a VAV box. I wasn't asking them to go in and install an air handler, because you'll figure out if they master most of the fundamental skills with simple things. When you start to make things super complex, that's where it becomes harder to measure if folks are going and having success. Alrighty. So with that being said, you've got S2, which is your skills and your evaluation, and a programmer. What you would do is basically, once again, a basic VAV box program, usually something like a reheat, maybe something like a series or a parallel reheat. I'm not going to try to spell that. Parallel fan reheat. And you would go and have a leaderboard as to who can program that the fastest. Now, obviously, this takes a little bit longer than going in and installing a VAV controller, but you'll start to see their familiarity with the program. You'll start to see their ability to translate a sequence to actual code, and you'll see their familiarity with understanding logic blocks. So you'll be able to identify skill sets. Those are some examples of how you would do that, right? So then we move on to step number 3, which is strengths and weaknesses. Okay? So strengths and weaknesses, what we're doing right here is we're going and we're looking at, what did they do in the evaluation that was a strength? So we'll just call that S. And what did they do that was a weakness? Now, there's 2 schools of thought here. I'll tell you the school of thought I lean towards, but it's up to you to decide on your strategy, which ultimately is step 4. So you identify your strengths and weaknesses, and then we move on to step 4 right here, which will be picking your strategy. Now, your strategy can be that you decide to either have strong strengths or strong weaknesses. I personally am a fan of strong strengths and just going and avoiding weaknesses as long as they are not critical weaknesses. If someone can't understand basic safety rules, like I had this one guy who was literally sitting on a pipe with no hard hat in the ceiling in an elementary school as students walked by. Like, that's kind of basic, admission to the game is practicing safety. So that's not something that you would say, oh, that's not a weakness I want to work on. But, if you've got a programmer and he's weak in electrical knowledge, then you're not going to go and spend all your time focusing on getting their electrical knowledge up. So this is something you want to focus in on, is strengths and weaknesses. I believe in going and identifying their strengths and making their strengths stronger and creating a list of your team and what their strengths and weaknesses are. That way you can apply them to the proper projects. And when you start to learn how to do this, you'll see a marked increase in your effectiveness. Now, for those of you who have listened so far, it sounds a lot like I've been talking about folks who are managing teams. But you can apply this to yourself. Whether you manage a team or not, you can still go through every step I've done so far and apply it to yourself. You can go and say, I want to become a programmer. Well, what skill sets do programmers need? And then where am I at? And then what are my strengths? And what do I need to do to go and get stronger, or maybe even do a role change? All right. So now we move on to step 5, which is laying out the training plan. So laying out training. All right. So here we go, and this is very difficult for some folks, especially if they're not part of a larger organization that has a formulated training and evaluation program. If you're, part of a system integrator, or maybe you're a smaller group or a medium-sized group, and you don't have a formal training plan, then you're really going to want to pay attention to this, because this is going to help you start that. First decision you need to make is, do you want to do task or skill-based training? And at first glance, those may sound like the same thing. but they're not. See, task-based training is where you're going and you're saying, hey, I'm going to go and install a controller on a VAV box. That has multiple different skills in that task. And that is something that you have to decide. Do you want to do task or do you want to do skill? Now, skill is going to be, okay, I want to learn this HVAC sequence and I want to be able to describe how this HVAC sequence works. So task may be going and programming a VAV box, whereas skill may be just simply explaining the VAV box sequence. I personally lean towards skill training because here's the thing. If you focus on a task, you can be focusing on several skills that the person doesn't need to develop. And that's why, in our industry, we tend to say, hey, we're hands-on learners. We need to be out there doing stuff. And I agree with that. You do need to get hands-on. You do need to be doing things, but you should be hands-on specific to a skill. So what would that look like? So back to this VAV programming. So let's say VAV programming and then VAV sequence. We realize that the programmer's weakness is interpreting HVAC sequences. So what we want to do here is we want to go and we want to take a VAV sequence, have them interpret that sequence and explain how that sequence would operate. We are working on the skill of HVAC sequence understanding. Versus if we focused on VAV programming, they would also be focused on programming, they would be focused on using a tool. So you're doing multiple different skills and you're not focusing in on the biggest skill that they need to develop. Now, this is personal preference. You can definitely focus on task. It's not necessarily any better. I've just seen faster results by focusing in on a specific skill. So while you're doing this, you need to decide how you're going to measure progress. So this is also part of step 5. So how do you measure progress? Well, when you're dealing with something as simple as mounting a actuator or wiring up a transformer, it's pretty easy to see if they understand it or don't. But when you're dealing with something like HVAC sequence knowledge, how do you go and evaluate progress? Well, this is where things get kind of subjective. You have to be involved, and this is where I see things kind of collapse, is that when things are more subjective, so when you're doing things like evaluating knowledge versus someone going and doing a specific task, you need to have involvement. So this is the more subjective the task, the more involved you need to be. So if you're going and doing a very subjective task, like knowledge of something or being able to explain a concept, then you need to go and touch base with the person more so you can measure their success, because often they'll figure out concepts faster than tasks. It's kind of weird that way. But what you have to do is the more subjective it gets, the more involved you need to be, and then you need to document what you're doing. Okay? So then obviously step 6 is you need to implement your plan. And this is where you go and you actually take the tasks that you are working on and you implement them. So whatever the task or skill that you're developing, you set aside a dedicated time, and that dedicated time is when that person works on that skill. Now, usually what you can do is you can have that person do a weekly time. And this is something that's kind of funny to me. So you look at a lot of really high-performing IT companies, and they actually give their employees time off to go and develop skills. Then you look at BAS companies, and we often are running our employees ragged, not giving them time to develop skills, pulling them in for a combination training/safety meeting that really no one's paying attention to, just they're there to eat the donuts and check the box. And then we don't really put into these employees, and then we wonder why the employees leave or why the employees can't do a task. There's this old saying of, how does it go? It was two lumberjacks, and one of the lumberjacks bet the other lumberjack that they could go and cut down a bunch of trees. And so about quarter of the way through, the lumberjack number one looks at lumberjack number two, and lumberjack number two is sitting down. And he's like, "Why are you sitting down?" And he says to lumberjack number one, "Well, I'm sharpening my axe." And by doing that, he's able to cut down more trees because he's taking time to stay sharp. We need to make sure that we're taking time, and I know it's hard. Trust me, I was managing 120 plus projects at the same time and over 60 million in revenue and 22 techs. I get the constraints that are placed on you and how you got GCs calling and yelling at you and nothing's on time because they decided to award your contract late. I get what it's like, but you still need to spend the time to go and develop your team. And finally, step number 7 is you've got to record everything. We're not recording everything to fire people. We're recording everything to go and make sure that we're seeing progress and that we're noticing, hey, this person's not picking this up. Maybe we should focus them on something else. From personal experience, it's actually quite relieving to folks when you go and they are really struggling with something and they're just never going to get it. And you go and you assign them to do something different that they will get, that they are good at. That personally, I've seen a lot of success with that. I've seen a lot of people who are very thankful because they were trying to do one thing and it was just because we were forcing them in that role and they weren't any good at it. So that's, you want to record that. Now, let me recap real quick before I go and answer questions. And I'd encourage you to type in any questions you have on this topic in the question box. I can see that in the comments and I can answer those in the order I receive them during the question and answer period. Now, here's the deal. Like I said, any good development plan needs to be customized, measurable, and rapidly impactful. Those have to be there from the get-go. And then once you have that, you go through a series of steps. So whether you're managing a team or this is yourself, you're going to go through some steps, which are step 1, you figure out the desired skill set for either your team or the role you want or the role you're in. You evaluate that skill set either using an interview process, which I don't really recommend, or skill set evaluations through tests, exams, and practice. Step number 3, we go and we identify our strengths and weaknesses. My personal perspective is to focus on strengths unless the weaknesses are critical things like, hey, this person can't be in a room with living people and we need to feed them under the door because they can't go and interact with people. I've actually had folks like that. We had one guy, we called him the vampire because he was an amazing programmer, but he could not be around people. And that was fine. I could manage around that. And we called him the vampire because he would work nights and he would write all the code. We'd come in the morning and all the code would be done. It'd be done right. Everything worked. So we were cool with that. I just needed to know that this was a guy I could never send out on a job site. And basically, I just had him write code. So then step 4, like I said, is decide on that strategy, focus on strengths or weaknesses, or potentially a role change. Step 5 is laying out that training plan. You got to decide, are we doing task or skill-based training? You got to decide how you're going to measure progress and how often you're going to do follow-up, which as things become more subjective, you really want to make sure that you're doing follow-up. Step 6 is implementing your plan. You want to go and make sure that you're implementing and tracking a plan. And then step 7, you want to go record the results of this plan so that you have a baseline moving forward. All right, so with that, we've got a little bit of time here. We're at the 30 mark, 9:30, which is right about where I was aiming for. We've got some time for question and answer on anything related to training, anything you'd like to know around training. Maybe you're trying to figure out your training goals, or you're trying to go and develop your training goals. This would be a time for you to go and ask your question via the chat feature, and I'll be able to answer those questions in the order they are received. So definitely go and take advantage of that. I've got a wealth of knowledge that I can go and answer questions and give you guidance and tell you what's worked for me and been able to help me go from, losing my first job in BAS to leading the integration program for a Fortune 100 company. So, and as I wait for you all to enter some comments, I will just go and get everything else ready here. Let me clear this off. Already. Not seeing any comments. That's okay. That's fine. So in our next episode, I had someone ask me about remote access and being able to demonstrate remote access. So that's actually going to be our next episode. That's going to be episode number 5. And we are going to be going and talking through why getting remote access from an IT group is so hard. And so this week's episode is a little unique. It is actually sponsored by my group mentoring program that I have open right now. It is called Building Automation Monthly Premium, and it's my group mentoring and training program that I open 4 times a year. So that's open right now. I'll provide a link below the video. I encourage you to go and check that out. I'll give you a little preview of what that looks like. Essentially, you go and you get access to a series of things. One is group mentoring calls with me. Every other week, we hop on a call like this, and it's recorded, and then we're able to go and answer a series of questions on these group calls. So as you can see, I've been doing several of these calls, and you can see the kind of questions that get asked, and we provide timestamps and video recordings, and you get to ask whatever questions you have around building automation. So that's pretty awesome. And then you also get access to all of my courses that I have available during your membership. So if you're interested in purchasing one of my training courses, this is something you definitely want to take advantage of because my training courses cost as much as the mentoring program does. So it's kind of a no-brainer to go about that. And then finally, every month I interview a subject matter expert on a topic, and I also do a special teaching topic. So for example, last month I interviewed a system integrator. Before that, I did commissioning agents, energy managers, and I record these. And then I do special teachings. So these are all things that are really going to help you take your building automation career to the next level. And I really encourage you to take advantage of this program while it's still open. It closes down again on January 8th. So with that being said, that is it for today's episode. I'm not seeing any questions in the question box. And in the next episode, I will be going and discussing why getting remote access from IT is so hard. I really look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time. Also, if you're in the United States and you're going to be at the ASHRAE Expo, so that is in Chicago, that's the week of the 22nd. If you're going to be at that expo, I will be teaching Building Automation Systems 101 at the ASHRAE Expo. And I'd love to have a chance to meet you, to shake your hand, to just catch up, learn more about you, what you're doing in the building automation industry. So definitely just shoot me a note here in the comments, and I'd love to see you there. If you're able to be there, that would be awesome. With that being said, I am going to end the video right now. Thank you so much for being here on this week's episode. And as always, any suggestions, any comments or ideas how I can make this even better for you, I'd love to hear them. I'm doing this because I really have a passion to see you succeed in building automation and in your building automation career. And I know from experience, building automation is one of, if not the most rewarding fields out there. And I really want you to have a successful career. So thank you so much for giving me your time and attention. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be able to present to you. So until next week, continue to push through, continue to learn, set up your goals for 2018. I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.